So anyway, we're going to review for the exam. To the extent you find that useful, great. If you feel like you would be better served just spending your own time studying or whatever, you can feel free to drop off Zoom whenever you are done with the review session, okay? So that will be kind of what we're going to do tomorrow or this afternoon, okay? So let's just jump in as quickly as we can. All right, everybody cross your fingers, cross your feet, pray to any gods that you have nearby. Is this going to work? You've got to be kidding me. Why is this not working? It was working just a minute ago.
Okay, now we can't hear you.
We can hear you, Todd.
Todd, we can't hear you. No. Thumbs down. Can't hear you.
Can you hear me now?
Yes.
All right. Whew. Okay. Now, can you hear me? And also, can I share my iPad screen? This would be amazing. Oh my God. All right. Unbelievable. Okay. So we left off this morning talking about institutions, right? And we talked about a whole range of things. And, you know, by all means, I don't mean to suggest that these are totally inclusive in the sense that this is the only things that matter for institutions. There's a lot of things that matter for institutions, but I just wanted to talk about some of the main things. And so we talked about things like property rights, and we talked about political and legal systems. We talked about things like stability in terms of macro policy and promoting quality education and promoting competitive markets and providing public research into roads and bridges and basic research and development. There's one other really important thing that governments can do to create quality institutions that incentivize productive behavior, and that is to promote international trade. Promoting international trade. Trade is good. And as I'm going to show you in some data here in a second, countries that trade more with other countries are richer than countries that don't, right? Trading more with other countries makes your country richer. Why is that exactly? What is it about trade that leads to growth? Well, we've talked about some of these things. The biggest one we talked about last week and will be on your exam tomorrow, which is the whole idea of specialization. How do you increase your productivity? You specialize. And trade allows for more specialization, right? So think about a country like South Korea. South Korea has 3 automobile manufacturers. How in the world would a country that's relatively small like South Korea have 3 automobile manufacturers? Quite simple. They don't make cars just for South Korea. They make them for the world. And they have specialized in that industry. By specializing in that industry, they have become one of the most productive car manufacturing centers in the world. That has allowed them to sell more abroad and has increased their productivity. And so in thousands of different ways, countries that trade more specialize more. Very importantly, trade is not just trade in goods and services. It's also trade in ideas, right? So when countries trade, they do trade goods and ideas, but they trade goods and services, but they also trade ideas, right? One way that countries learn from richer countries is through trade. And so this idea of technology transfer is a crucial component of becoming rich, right? What would happen if the US closed ourselves off from the rest of the world in terms of trade? It would basically mean that we would not be able to adopt the ideas that are going on in the rest of the world. And so lots of good ideas are developed in the rest of the world, whether you're talking about vaccines or whether you're talking about new products. And so this is particularly important for poorer countries though, right? Poor countries that don't have all of the institutions that the US has that encourage more technology. Poor countries in particular are reliant upon technology transfer. And so, this morning I was talking about that example of why do they have old computers in the Bahamas? I did a little research on this and come to find out that the Bahamas actually had import quotas, meaning limits on imports of computers. And partly this is because the Bahamas thought, oh, we can build these computers ourselves. No, they can't. And as a result, they completely blocked themselves off from new technology that they could get just 90 miles away, right? That's just bad government, right? When you hear arguments against free trade, most arguments against free trade are what I would call magical thinking. And by magical thinking, I mean, well, if we don't buy it, we'll just make it here. That's magical thinking, because you just don't make everything here because you don't have the ability to do this, right? Probably you're not aware of this, but if we went back to 1900, right, a little bit over 120 years ago, which was the richer area of the world, Africa or Asia? Africa. Africa was richer than Asia 120 years ago. Today, Asia is about 300% richer than Africa, 3 times as rich. What in the world happened? Well, many things have happened, but one of the biggest was that African countries tended to promote what's called import substitution. Meaning most of their policies were organized around this idea of let's import less and let's trade less and become more self-sufficient. So most countries, when they became independent in Africa in the 1960s, quickly moved to these policies of import substitution where they blocked international trade. This is much different than what happened in Asia. In Asia, as countries became independent, countries that were once colonized, became independent in the 1960s, they tended to follow policies of export promotion. And by this, I mean specializing in industries that explicitly focus on selling goods abroad. So you see countries like Japan or South Korea, they didn't shy away from international trade. They made international trade a key component of their strategy of getting rich. And why? Because trade allowed them to take advantage of these 2 things I've talked about. It allowed them to specialize, and it allowed them to attract new technology. Which of these strategies paid off? Well, I don't have to tell you, right? Export promotion, countries that have followed export promotion have done much better than countries that have tried to block trade. And this is one of the things that continues to keep Africa poor, right? Africa is a big continent, but it actually has relatively low population density. So there's not many people in Africa relative to the size of the continent. And it has 52 countries in it. So what is Africa? Africa is largely a bunch of small countries. And so you can imagine how difficult it is to operate in an environment where you're closed off from trade, right? I lived for a period of time in Botswana, Africa, which is in southern Africa. Botswana is the size of Texas, but it has 1/3 of the people that Iowa has, okay? You can imagine how disastrous import substitution policies have been for Botswana. Because the fact of the matter is, when you only have 1.5 million people, you're not going to be able to make everything you need. And so it's magical thinking, right? The magical thinking is, well, if I don't buy it from somebody else, somehow we're magically going to make it here. It just doesn't work that way. And in most of Africa, it's been disastrous, right? This policy of closing your borders to trade has been disastrous. So one of the strongest relationships in economics is this relationship that countries that trade more grow faster. So let me show you. Let me show you a picture. If my screen sharing works, on the odd chance that it works, or if Word works for me. I'm getting the bouncing Word app at the bottom, bouncing. It's not going to pull up. Okay, maybe this is working. There's still a chance I'm going to frisbee this whole computer and everything out the window. Okay, where are we? Okay, this is what I want to show you. If you can see this on your screen, it's a little small. I apologize for that. But this is looking at countries that trade more, are richer, and have lower unemployment rates. And so on the left-hand side, you see the growth rate of countries. Countries are put into one of three categories: rich countries, non-globalizers, and globalizers, right? The globalizers are countries that trade. The non-globalizers are countries that don't trade. And it's hard to see here, but basically we see that countries, rich countries and countries that trade more are richer than poor countries. And this has gotten increasingly important over time. That this wasn't so much true in the 1960s, but today it is very true that globalizers are a lot richer than non-globalizers. And this is really the distinction between Africa and Asia again. If we look on the right-hand side, we see very much a similar story with unemployment rates. The globalizers have much lower unemployment rates than the non-globalizers, right? And so, you know, you can look at this 100 different ways. This is a very simplistic way of looking at it. But you can look at this 100 different ways. You're going to keep on coming up with the same conclusion, that one of the reliable ways to make your country rich is to trade more, right? And so that's an important part of creating productive institutions. So we talked about a number of things here this morning that contribute to productive institutions. And once again, I don't want to say that that's an all-inclusive list. There's definitely other things that matter. And in fact, if this is a question that's interesting to you, then you can take some more economics courses, right? I teach a course on macroeconomic seminar where we basically talk about growth and growth theory for an entire block, right? And we talk a lot more about institutions. Or you can take my class in China, where we go to China and we talk about just these ideas, but specifically comparing the US economy to China, right? And thinking about the ways that institutions in China differ and how that contributes to the growth in the Chinese economy. So, you know, at some level, when economists get to this topic of growth, it always comes down to institutions and incentives, right? That productivity is important, and productivity is determined by those big three things of physical capital, human capital, and technology. But what determines those? Incentives. Incentives that are shaped by our institutions. Now, there's a whole range of things that I've not talked about. And the reason why I've not talked about them is because, quite honestly, there's not a lot of evidence that they matter. Or if they matter, they don't matter in the way that we think they do. So let's call this the things that don't really matter. Right, the things that don't really matter. And I'm going to talk about a couple of these very, very quickly. natural resources. The fact of the matter is we really see no relationship between countries that have lots of natural resources and those who don't. In fact, if there's a relationship, it might be a negative relationship. And this is the idea that's referred to often as the resource curse. I don't know why this is jumping. Having natural resources might actually discourage growth because they encourage a whole range of bad institutions such as theft and corruption. So to pick one example, consider the Congo. I think I mentioned the Congo this morning. The Congo is in Central Africa. It's the poorest country in the world. It also probably is the richest country in terms of natural resources. Why is the Congo such a disaster? In part because the natural resources, right? When the Congo was colonized, it was colonized by Belgium, who essentially came in and used the Congo as a cash register. It came in, it enslaved people, and it pulled out natural resources, whether those natural resources were gold and minerals, or whether those natural resources were rubber. And so over the period of time, Congo essentially became this kleptocracy, meaning it was basically organized around theft. And what happened when the Congo became independent? It became independent from the colonizers, from the European colonizers, but who came to take power? Local people who essentially kept all the same institutions to make themselves rich, right? So in other words, instead of being run by a bunch of white dictators, Congo has traditionally been run by a bunch of black dictators since it became independent. The institutions have not changed. And the institutions are whoever owns the land owns the money. And so it leads to theft and corruption. It can lead to civil conflict and a whole range of other very negative things that impact institutions. And so, yes, do we see countries that have natural resources that are rich? Yeah, like a country like Finland actually has a lot of natural resources and is rich. But do we see countries that have lots of natural resources and are poor? Yes. And so, the question is not whether you have natural resources. The question is, what do your institutions look like? Once again. And it seems like you can have good institutions or bad institutions depending upon what your resources look like. All right, I'm going to lose my mind. For some reason, this keeps on jumping. Population growth. We talked about Malthus this morning, but the fact of the matter is, Malthus was wrong. We have seen an increase in population and an increase in incomes. Why is that? Growth is about more than capital. And there's a good argument to be made that the more people we have, the more ideas we have. I don't know what in the world is going on with this thing. Technology comes from networks. What's probably one of the most fundamental misperceptions about where technology comes from? One of them is that technology is somehow developed by geniuses working alone in their labs. That is almost where no technology comes from. In reality, most innovation comes from people networking, meaning large groups of people working on little parts of a big problem. What's the thing about bigger population? You have bigger networks. We have more people working on more problems. And so one of the things that we observe is that very rarely are new innovations, new technologies associated with one person, right? I mean, for instance, a lot of us probably think about Apple and Steve Jobs. Steve Jobs did not create Apple by himself, right? He had lots of creative people associated with him, right? And he'd be the first to admit that. So that we tend to like personalize everything in our narratives, but in reality, that's not how the world works. The world works with networks. And the more people we have, the more networks we have. Today, what are we seeing as we get richer? Today, we're seeing a change in this relationship between income and population. Today, as incomes go up, what's happening? We're actually choosing to have fewer children. And so population growth is declining, particularly in the rich world. And I think we've talked about this, right? We talked about this last week when we talked about labor markets. And in part, it's because of the change in the nature of labor. I never considered having 10 kids because I knew that having 10 kids would be very expensive to send them all to cello lessons. Right? Now, a farmer in sub-Saharan Africa has a bunch of different incentives that they face, right? It makes sense to have a larger family when you have a family that's basically doing subsistence farming. But when you are living in an information culture and a human capital intensive culture, the incentives change. The incentives tend to go toward having fewer kids than you invest more in each one of them. And so that's largely why in rich countries, we've seen population growth fall dramatically. And in some countries, it's actually negative, right? That we're not having enough babies to even replace people that are dying. So Malthus was all wrong, right? Malthus is all wrong about a bunch of things. What are we on here? The size of government. What's better, big government or small government? The data is very conclusive. Good government. You can have big governments that work well and small governments that work well. You can have big governments that are bad and small governments that are bad, right? The size of government doesn't really matter. It's whether government creates the proper incentives. Likewise, culture. There is not one single culture that's consistent with economic growth, right? Some people want to say, well, look at Western Europe. It's European culture that's more consistent with growth. Well, that's a hard argument to make now that we see all these Asian countries growing, right? We have seen different cultures grow. We've seen different cultures be disasters. We've seen countries with the same culture be growth disasters and growth miracles and growth disasters and growth miracles, like China, right? This idea of, and this has a long history in economics of like trying to blame poor countries for being poor because of their cultural dysfunction is just not, it just doesn't make any sense. In fact, a lot of these explanations really kind of border on on implicit racism, to be honest with you. That doesn't mean that there's nothing about culture that matters, because there are. And if I can just pick one example, cultural preferences towards women working is a part of culture that does matter. So, you know, in countries in which women are not allowed to work and they can't participate in the marketplace, that is undoubtedly going to play a big role in how rich your country is. I don't know if we blame that on culture or we just blame that on a society that accepts a minor role for women and exaggerates the power of men. But, you know, this is not to say that there's cultural attitudes never matter, but it's unlikely that culture is the primary determinant of why rich countries are rich and poor countries are poor. And then finally, foreign aid. Why is foreign aid unlikely to work? And I'm sorry, I'm gonna close off my screen because now I'm having problems with my batteries. So I'm trying to save.
Is it not consistent?
Why is foreign aid unlikely to work? Well, who gets most of the foreign aid? Rich countries or poor countries?
Africa.
Poor countries, right? Why are these poor countries poor? Because usually they have bad institutions and there's lots of corruption. And so what happens when you give aid to a country that has high levels of corruption, has low levels of human capital, has low levels of technology, doesn't respect property rights? You give them aid, and where does all the aid go? It gets wasted or it gets stolen, right? And so quite frankly, a lot of aid is wasted over time. That's not to say that all aid is wasted, right? I mean, there are some ways that aid can benefit countries. But in general, these kind of blank checks, aid where you just give countries a bunch of money or you go in and you build a big dam, has not led to big booms in growth, right? It just has not been successful because once again, it comes back to institutions, right? You have to have those institutions in place. If institutions are in place, then yes, you know, it can be, aid could be potentially useful. But oftentimes aid goes to the countries who could really use it the least effectively. And that has been a hard lesson that most of the world has tried to learn again and again and again. Okay, so that's kind of our discussion about institutions here. And so tomorrow afternoon, after our exam in the morning, we will have a short afternoon class, once again on Zoom. I don't think we'll go much more than an hour, and we'll finish up chapter 9. Okay, that's kind of the objective for tomorrow. But anyway, we kind of got through most of chapter 9, just a little bit more to finish up. Okay, let's transition while I still have power here before my computer goes bonkers. Let's transition to talking about the exam. So let's be clear, everybody, what's on the exam. The exam is on chapters 1, which is just kind of an introductory chapter. Chapter 3 on supply and demand. Chapter 2, or part of chapter 2, which is on comparative advantage. Not the entire chapter, but just the part that we talked about, those 5 pages. Chapter 7 on GDP and inflation. Chapter 8 on unemployment and inflation. And chapter 10 on finance and financial systems. What we talked about today will not be on your exam tomorrow. It will be on your exam it'll be on your second exam, but it won't be on this first exam. So we will start the exam at 9 a.m. As I said, I expect everybody other than the people who are in this class full-time online to be at the exam. And I'm still having problems with people not showing up to class and just jumping on Zoom without letting me know. So I expect everybody to be here in person unless you're sick. So we will start at 9 o'clock and we will end at 11:30. For those of you who are taking the class online, you can expect an email from me at 9 o'clock, okay? Do not bring your phones, all right? Bring a calculator, right? So you cannot use your phone as a calculator. This is closed notes exams, so but whether you're in person or online, you cannot be using additional resources. For those of you who are on Zoom, you should keep your camera on and communicate with me via chat if you have any questions. Okay.
Do we need to bring?
And then the exam will last till 11:30, right? I really think that for most of you, time should not be of an issue, right? If you have an accommodation, I will honor that. So I'll give you extra time, but unless you've talked with me about an accommodation, then the exam will be done at 11:30. But as I said, I really don't think that should be much of a constraint. I don't want to say it's not going to be any constraint because I've been in this business long enough to know that there are some students where I could give them 10 hours and they'll sit there. But, I think most of you will find 2.5 hours to be plenty of time. And then other than that, it's just going to be kind of a mix of short answer, problem, definitions, the same kind of questions that you've seen on your first two quizzes. So my goal, I honestly mean this, my goal is not to surprise you, okay? I am not looking for questions that are just like completely out of the blue or you're like, what in the hell did that come from, right? That is not the goal of this class, right? The goal of this class is, have you been working on the material and grinding through and doing the work and learning, all right? And so I'm not going to try to ask questions that are completely out of left field to surprise you or anything, nothing. There should be no gotcha questions on this. I hope that there are no gotcha questions on this. And so the best advice I can give you for this exam, which is really the best advice that you can get for any exam, and once again, years and years of giving exams always make me come back to the same two pieces of advice that I can give you. First, read the question, okay? Carefully, patiently read the question and think about what's actually being asked as opposed to what you think you want to be asked or what you think might be asked. And then the second is, think a little bit before you write, right? So you should have plenty of time to finish this exam. So, think a little bit before you write. Before you start writing, give it a little bit of thought and try to organize your thoughts. For the short answers, I think all of them can be answered in 2 or 3 sentences. So there's not a need to write a great deal. So, once again, sit down, think about what you want to write, and then write. I think those two pieces of advice continue to be very, very good pieces of advice, right? In terms of doing the best on the exam as you can. Okay, so does anybody have any questions about just kind of the structure of the exam, right? How this is all going to work tomorrow? Anything about the structure or the logistics of the exam?
I've got a question, but I guess it's in regards to the time.
Yeah, Max?
Of the can we at all negotiate the start of the exam?
Sorry, Max, I don't know if you're talking, but I can't hear you. Can the rest of you hear me? Hear Max?
I can hear Max.
I don't think he can hear
Hold
me.
on for a second, Max. Right, try it again, Max.
Can you hear me?
Now I can hear you, sorry.
Okay, I was wondering if the start of the exam was at all negotiable, because I feel like I take tests better after lunch, and I'm finding I'm having a lot of difficulty focusing in the morning. Is there any chance we could?
Let's talk about this individually, but probably because we have class in the afternoon.
All right.
But I can talk with you individually about this.
That sounds good. And also, do you have any studying recommendations other than reading through the notes and looking at all the definitions and everything? Yeah,
so I think some of these I shared with you on Friday. first off, trying to find as many active ways as you can study as possible, not just studying through the notes, but making flashcards or sitting down and talking through your notes with people or asking questions with each other, I think are very good study habits to get into. So I don't think it makes sense for you to study all by yourself, but I also don't think it makes sense for you to study all with other people. So a little bit of mix, right? If you spend a little bit of time studying by yourself, but also some time with other people, talking through things can be very useful. And then I think you need to work some problems. And at the end of all these chapters, there's lots of problems to do, whether it's calculating CPI, GDP deflator, supply and demand, right? There's lots of problems. You can also go online for any of these and find lots of examples. And so, I think how many problems you need to do, I think is something that differs a lot between individuals. But I know some people feel more comfortable if they can work a lot of problems. And so, the problems are there are questions at the end of each of your chapters. So in my experience, those are some of the best strategies for studying for the exam. Of course, there's other things you could do too. I definitely recommend, to have read your book, right? The book is a complement to the lectures. It's not a substitute. Lectures don't substitute for the book, right? They're complements. They work together. And then I think also, if there's particular things that you struggle with, one of the nice things about getting everything recorded on Zoom is you can go back and watch those parts. So, I don't think it's a particularly useful way for most of you to study is to go back and watch all my lectures tonight, right? I think that's not a very effective use of your time. But if there's, things you're struggling with, right? Specific ideas that you're kind of grappling with, go back and watch that part of the lecture, right? I think that can also be a very useful tool. Okay, any other questions about logistics, whatever? If not, let me just open it up. So who has questions about topics or things that they would like to spend some time reviewing or whatever?
Like do more like reviews on unemployment and inflation, chapter 8, and also chapter 10, which is finance and systems.
Yes, so what is your question?
Can we like do like more problem solving for unemployment and inflation? Yeah.
So you mean you want to do a problem calculating unemployment?
Yes.
Okay. So what is the unemployment rate, Ella? How do we calculate it? What's the formula?
One second.
So right, so it's hard to do this right if we don't know the formulas, right? If we don't know the formulas. So this is the number of people who are unemployed divided by the number of people who are unemployed plus the number of people who are employed times 100. Remember that these two things together is what we call the labor force. So this is actually a very simple calculation. If you know the number of people unemployed and you know the number of people employed, it's just a simple, and you know the formula, then it's a simple calculation, right? So if the number of unemployed people is 60 million, the number of employed is 200 million, and what's the unemployment rate? That, right? I don't have my calculator on me. This country's got a big problem with unemployment, 23%. So that's really just a fairly straightforward formula. We also calculated something called the labor force participation rate. Because notice here, when we calculate unemployment, it's not as a percent of the labor force. I'm sorry, it's not as a percent of the population, it's a percent of the labor force. And so how do we calculate the labor force participation rate? This is the number of people in the labor force divided by the population. And usually we only include the population that's 16 and over. Okay? Okay, who else has some questions?
I got a question, Todd.
Yeah, Bradley.
So it was like day 4, finishing up chapter 8. We were talking about like the actual rate of unemployment and the natural, and then he did these like 3 different things where it was like U is equal to the natural rate of U, and then it was like side by side with like Y equals the natural rate of Y. There was like 3 different ones, and some of them had like the greater than or less than signs. Could you just like run through that quick, like quick explaining that?
Yeah, sure. So what I was trying to talk about there is, first off, what is the natural rate of unemployment? What do we mean by that? Anybody, Bradley or somebody else want to jump in? What's the definition of the natural rate of unemployment?
Isn't it? So it's structural plus frictional unemployment together, but it's not cyclical.
Right. And it's also that we can also think about it as the long run rate of unemployment, the long run average rate of unemployment. Okay. So we have this long run average rate of unemployment. That's the natural rate. And if we're at the natural rate of unemployment, we are also at what we can think of as the natural rate of output, meaning our long run average rate of output. Okay. So what I was trying to make, the point I was trying to make here in that section of the notes is my screen coming on, is when unemployment equals the natural rate, U star is the natural rate, then output is equal to its natural rate. But what happens if actual unemployment is less than the natural rate? Then what's going to be true about output? Output is going to typically be greater than the natural rate. There's a negative relationship between unemployment and output. If unemployment goes down below the natural rate, then output is going to go up above its natural rate. And vice versa, what happens if actual unemployment goes up above its natural rate? Then output is going to fall below its natural rate. So this is really a more, you might think it's a more complicated way, but I'm just trying to give you a more detailed way of just understanding this relationship that unemployment and output move in opposite directions. When output goes up, unemployment tends to go down, and vice versa.
All right, sounds good. Yeah, that makes a lot more sense.
Good. You weren't the only person that had that question. I think I know that a couple of people also had that question. All right, don't be shy. Jump in. Who's got some other questions?
Yeah,
Okay, I didn't see who is talking. Evan.
Yeah. So when a country's equilibrium interest rate is higher than the global, will that impact its savings and investment spending identity?
Yes, yes. So in class, we developed this relationship, right? Oh, I don't know why I wrote it like that. In class, we developed this relationship that in a closed economy, right, savings has to equal investment. S has to equal I. But in an open economy, they can be different. And the difference is made up by the trade deficit, right? Or I'm sorry, the trade balance. And if the trade balance is positive, the country is also a net saver because S is greater than I, according to this equation. Vice versa, if X is less than M, so just to interrupt here, I don't know what's going on with my computer, but it is getting very close to being zero about battery power, even though I have it plugged in and I have a battery plugged into it. So there is a chance that I will just get cut off. And if I get cut off, I'll send you all an email, and maybe later this afternoon after I've had a chance to recharge it, we could extend our office hours a little bit later this afternoon. Okay. So just so you know, if I get cut off, I'll send you an email later about when we could possibly pick this up. So anyway, this is the relationship that we talked about in class. And so then we moved on talking about our loanable funds market. And we talked about the loanable funds market determining the interest rate. And in a closed economy, the interest rate is going to be the interest rate that makes savings equal to investment. That makes savings equal to investment. But what happens if it's not a closed economy? If it's not a closed economy, then savings and investment are going to be determined by the world interest rate. Not the rate that makes savings equal investment, but by what world interest rates are. So we talked about an example in class where what happens if the world interest rate was up here? If it was up here, it's above our domestic market clearing interest rate. So savings would be up here, investment would be down here, and what's true? Savings is greater than investment. In other words, this case, savings would be greater than investment, so we would have a trade surplus, and we would be a net saver. And if interest rates were below this, in the red, then we'd have the opposite case, where I would be up here and S would be down here. So in that case, we do this, right? Where we'd be a net borrower and we'd be running a trade deficit. So it's more complicated, or I don't know if it's more complicated, it's just different in an open economy. In an open economy, savings doesn't have to equal investment. You can make up the difference by borrowing or lending from abroad. All right, does that help, Evan? Good. All right, who has some more questions?
Where's
Can you do the
Michael,
Go
how
ahead,
about
Mike.
you go first?
Yep.
What are some differences between savings and investments? Like this savings, like postponing consumption or spending, and investments, purchase of capital goods, R&D, and investments in new housing.
Yes. So what's your question?
Like, where are some how can we differentiate those between those two? I guess.
Well, savings is postponing consumption. So if you put money in a bank, you're savings. You're saving. You buy a share of stock, you're saving. You buy a bond, you're saving. If you stick money in your mattress, you're saving. Investment is, as you said, when firms purchase capital stock like a factory or equipment, when they spend money on research and development, when they spend money on inventories.
All right.
So the thing you want to avoid is confusing the two, because oftentimes when people put money in the stock market, they say that they're investing. But as economists, we consider that saving.
Okay. All right. That helped me.
Good. Somebody else had a question. I didn't see who it was.
It was me. Can we do a problem? Can we do a problem for the GDP deflator?
Yeah, let's do a short one. Okay, so let's say that we have, first off, there's lots of problems like this at the end of chapter 7, if you want to get more complicated problems. Well, let's say that we have 2 years. 2 years. Oh, shoot. Okay, so we have 2 years and 2 goods, and the goods have different prices and quantities in both years. And let's use (2020) as the base year. Okay, so that's going to be, when we calculate real GDP, that's going to be the set of prices that we use year after year. So 2019, let's calculate real GDP and let's calculate nominal GDP. And we can also calculate the average price index, or the deflator. Okay, what's nominal GDP? Aiden, what's nominal GDP?
I don't know. I'm pretty bad at these. So
I think it's
last
500.
round.
500, right? So for 19, you take the current price times the current quantity of both of the goods. So this is 10 times 20 plus 12 times 20. So what is this? 200.
Sorry, that's 440.
Right, 440. Okay?
So real GDP is the GDP for the base year.
Exactly.
Okay.
Exactly. So now we use 2020 prices, the 2019 quantity. So 2020 prices of good 1 is 15. Oh, can I change my example? I needed a better, I didn't change the quantities. So I'm going to change my example just to make it more interesting. We'll just change it in that simple way. Okay, so now it's 15 times 2019 quantities plus 20 times 2019 quantities.
Why do you use
400, whoops,
why do you use 2019 quantities?
because it's 2019 real GDP,
Okay. Okay.
right?
I see.
So this should be 700. And what's the deflator? It's nominal GDP divided by real GDP times 100. $62.9.
Thank you. Appreciate it.
And then we're not done yet though. What about 2020?
Oh yeah, you can do that.
Right?
So the nominal would be the 2020 numbers.
Right.
multiplied by those. So 15 times 22 and then
Yes.
22.
So this would be 330, 15 times 22 times 20 times 22, which is 440. That's 770. The rest of this problem is easy because in the base year, nominal GDP and real GDP are the same thing, and your average price index is 100.
Okay.
Okay? And
Thank
then if you're asked questions about what's the growth rate, you just have to take the percent changes between the 2 years. Okay?
Okay. Sounds good.
Who else has got some questions? I know a few of you had questions. For instance, Michael, I know that you had a couple of other questions. I didn't get a chance to answer them through email.
Yeah, some of them were already answered, but
Good.
like that, the U actual rate, but let's see. I looked at like some of the review problems, I guess, in the book for like 1, 2, 3, and 4 in chapter 10. Are those like good problems to go over, like for preparation for the exam?
Can you say that again? What chapter are you talking about?
Chapter 10. I guess it's the review problems. Let me.
Yeah, I hate to get into this because it seems like there's a problem between some people having the same edition of the book, but different kind of questions depending upon whether it's the physical copy of the book or whatever. But which were the questions you mentioned?
1, 2, and 4 under the review problems.
Yeah, I mean, those are good. I mean, I have to say, I think that none of these problems at the end of the chapter are bad problems to do. And I think all of them are good problems.
And I guess, like, is there any like other problems that would you recommend to focus on for the financial section?
Well, I mean, you know, we talked a lot about a lot of different things, right? We talked about what determines interest rates. There, quite honestly, there's a lot in chapter 10 that is just simply definitional stuff. You know, so I think chapter 10 in particular is a chapter that I would pay close attention to the definitions. Because there's just a lot of definitions like what is a stock, what is a bond, right?
Okay.
That I think would be fair game.
Okay.
So, yeah, I think in addition to to our discussion about the graphs related to the loanable funds market and interest rates, related to our discussion about savings and investment in closed and open economies, I think there's just also kind of a lot of definitional stuff that is important to spend some time on.
Okay, sweet. Thanks. That actually kind of answers a lot.
Good.
Can you go through a real and nominal interest rate example with like the I, the R, and the pi?
Well, yeah. Once again, this is largely just an equation, right? What we call the Fisher equation, which says that nominal interest rates equal real interest rates plus expected inflation. Now, the key to understanding this, though, is when we use expected inflation, this is really a ex ante real interest rate. And by ex ante, we mean before the fact. What we're hoping or what we think is going to happen. But many times what we think is going to happen doesn't happen because actual inflation turns out to be different than expected inflation. So if you are if you get into a loan that has a fixed interest rate, a fixed nominal interest rate, what's going to happen if inflation is higher than what you thought? That higher inflation is going to reduce the real interest rate that you pay. Okay, so in other words, what we have here is we kind of have a negative relationship. That when inflation goes up, real interest rates will go down if interest rates are fixed. So for instance, if you borrow money on a fixed rate mortgage, for instance, your real interest rate you pay is going to go down if inflation goes up. And vice versa, if inflation goes down, your real interest rate will go up if interest rates are fixed. And so without getting into the entire discussion again, we talked about how this creates winners and losers, right? That unexpected inflation tends to help borrowers and it hurts lenders. Just like unexpected deflation tends to help lenders and hurt borrowers. And so, yeah, that's what we talked about. The key here, though, is to recognize that what we think inflation is going to be may not be what inflation actually turns out to be. And so if you have a fixed interest rate loan, that's going to have a big implication. Or the same if you hold a bond, because remember, bonds have fixed coupon rates associated with them, right? Fixed nominal interest rates. I shouldn't say, I didn't use the word coupon rate, but coupon rate's just a fancy word for the interest rate on a bond. Those are fixed. And so if inflation goes up, that's going to reduce your real interest rate on holding that bond. And likewise, if interest rates go down, that will increase the real interest rate on holding that bond. Good? Okay. You are all are doing a good job of honing in on what I would consider to be fair game questions for tomorrow's exam. So that's good. You're asking questions about the right things.
Hey Todd.
Yeah.
Could you go over, it was like part of chapter 10, it was like in the beginning. So it was, we first started off with the expenditure equation and then we turned it into like using like T for taxes and TR for government transfer payments and had that like new equation set up.
What do you want me to do, Brad?
Just explain the whole equation where it's like y equals c plus I plus g plus t minus t plus tr minus tr?
Well, I'm reluctant to take the time to go through all of the math again, but what Whitney showed,
I guess I just didn't understand like the concept, like why we did that.
because I wanted to show that what has to be true in a closed economy that in a closed economy, savings has to equal investment. The purpose of going through all that was to show you that savings has to equal investment in a closed economy, right? So when we work through this in class, is to show you that total savings has to equal total investment. What is total savings? It has two components: private savings, how much households save, and then public savings, or how much the government saves. Okay, so it's just to prove that savings has to equal investment in a closed economy, right? It has to equal, savings has to equal investment. And to talk about that there's two different components to savings. The private part, which is meaning what households save, and then the public part, which is what governments save.
Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
Okay, good. Now remember, in an open economy, we have to add back in exports and imports. So that's how we get this equation, right? This is the equation in an open economy. I don't know why my M looks like that, but that's what the equation looks like in an open economy, where we add back in exports and imports. Okay? Who else has some questions?
I have a question for GTP, like what is not in the GTP? Like what would be some examples for what is not in a GTP?
GDP?
Yeah.
Well, anything that's not produced. So we talked about a lot of things. We don't want to include intermediate goods, right? So like goods that go into making something else, because we don't want to count them twice. We don't want to include any sort of transfer payments, which is just transferring money from one person to another. We don't want to include strict financial payments. Like putting money in a bank is not contributing to GDP. So, I mean, I could think of a lot of things that are not in GDP. I think the better way to think about this is what is in GDP. What's in GDP has to be final goods and services which are produced within a country's borders, right? So it's got to be, something has to be produced. It has to be a final good or service, and it has to be within a country's borders. Those are the most important parts of knowing what is included in GDP.
Okay.
For this private savings, is it Y plus TR or Y?
Yeah. It's Y plus. So you have to think about transfer payments as this is household income plus the money that you get from the government in transfers minus your taxes minus your consumption goods, right? So you think about all them, these first two parts you can think about as your revenue. And these last two parts you can think about as your expenses. So what's the difference between your revenue and your expenses? Savings. Okay, I think we have a question or time for one or two more questions, but then I might kind of cut out after that. So anybody else have a question or two? Okay, so really hearing none. I will check my email tonight. You know, it's hard to answer detailed questions through email. So, but you know, if you have like some sort of quick question or something's really bugging you, yeah, you can ask it. I'll also show up in person to the exam a little bit early tomorrow. So if you have some like last minute questions, you can ask them before the exam. I'll jump on Zoom too, for those of you who are taking the exam or not in person, and you can ask some questions on Zoom too. So yeah, I'll be around tonight if anybody has any quick questions. But assuming that that's not the case, we'll see all of you or most of you in person tomorrow, right? At Hedges at 9, and we'll see the 3 of you who are signed up permanently online. You'll get an email from me at 9 o'clock. Okay. All right. Good luck tonight. Right. Make sure you get a
Can I stay on after class?
Yeah, can I stay on too, or do you have a little better?
I have to leave here in a couple minutes, but I can stand for a minute or a couple.